Really appreciate you all joining us for this interactive discussion. Dear CEO, what your HR leader, what you don't know about how your HR leader feels. And I'm guessing the majority of you are sitting in HR and people roles right now. I know we have some business leaders who are joining us as well, hoping to kind of learn from these CPOs on what it's been like to kind of walk in these shoes and how they need to be thinking about building HR and people teams in this new era that we're in. So my name is Lars Schmidt. I am the founder of Amplify and host of the Redefining HR podcast. This particular event is actually the first live event under the new kind of Amplify banner, and it's a joint event with PeopleTech Partners. So the genesis of this conversation we're about to have actually started within PeopleTech Partners. So PeopleTech Partners, for those of you that aren't familiar, it's an incredible tech incubator and CPO kind of networking and community, primarily based out of the Bay, but with members, all around the US and even the world now. And we had an evening discussion on burnout in HR. And it was a lively discussion. I think this is something that many of you who are in operator seats have experienced, are experiencing, or perhaps will experience. I think it's a topic of conversation that's definitely front of mind for all of you operators in the field right now. And so the conversation really started there. And really our aim was, it took a lot of different paths. And I think, kind of where we landed is that this moment in time for HR is so unique because obviously the conversations around burnout and stress and just all the unique burdens on our roles have been, acute and sustained and just, it's been a lot really since the early days of the pandemic. At the same time, we're also in this really unique position as a field where the importance, the value, and the visibility of our field has been elevated to a place that we've always felt it should be, but now it's seen, it's central in so many aspects of how organizations are dealing with all of the things that we've been experiencing over the last 18 months. And then that's coupled with the fact that we're actually in this really unique space and time right now where we're creating new constructs for work itself. We have this real kind of once in a generation opportunity to redefine work, to redefine like where we work, how we work, when we work, how we're supported by our organizations, and so much more. So there's this real kind of duality in this moment that we're in. And so I'm really excited to be joined by 4 incredible people executives who I admire. We're just going to talk through a range of just all of the feelings and all the emotions. And particularly, we're going to be focusing on things that CEOs should know about leading and supporting and building people teams in this climate. So I want to open with a little bit of data before we get into the interactive discussion. So I want to start here. This is a framework that I've been developing really over the last couple of years, but it took shape even more, I think, this year when you look at the different key impact drivers for modern chief people officers. Back in the day, it was all about HR acumen. Right? We need to know the functional areas of the field. And, yes, you had to have, compassion. Some of these other areas were important, but the scope was perhaps more limited than it is today. Now it's equally as important that you have business acumen. Resiliency and grit are essential, especially right now. Compassion, adaptability, learning agility, so much is being thrown at us that we've never experienced before. And we've got to be able to adapt and keep pace with that. We've all heard the term, the Great Resignation. We're all probably feeling different aspects of that within our own organizations. But it's very real, and it's very real in our field, right? This is a graphic from Axios talking about the spike in HR job postings compared with kind of the baseline all jobs. And you can see it, there's a significant spike and it's continuing to climb. And I think for all of us in the field, we're being hit up by recruiters all the time. Anecdotally, we have an idea of what the Great Resignation is and how that impacts HR, but we haven't always had data around what does that really look like. So, anecdotally, we're seeing it, we're feeling it, but how is it actually showing up? And so one of the things we set out to do when we were talking about developing this live event is we wanted to actually get some of that data. We wanted to get a broad perspective from heads of people, CHROs and CPOs on really what their kind of views towards transitions have been over the last 18 months. And so, this is the result of that, which is fascinating. I think if you kind of look through this, again, anecdotally, we all know, you probably judge the market by the amount of, in-mails and emails you get from headhunters about roles, or looking through your LinkedIn feed, and it's like every other post is somebody celebrating a new job or somebody posting a job in the organization. So we're seeing that, but this data to me is really brings that reality home. 47% of CPOs who were in a job in January 2020 are no longer in that job. Many more have considered leaving, and almost 20%, or only almost 20%, actually are in a job now and have no plans on looking. Right, so that is transformative for our industry, and I want to invite our panelists out now to introduce themselves and also kind of get their interpretation on this data as we go a bit further. So Ciara, let's start with you. If you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself, and then if you wouldn't mind, share the the initial reactions once you had a chance to look through the data.
Thanks, Lars. Hi, everyone. I'm Ciara Lakhani, and I'm currently the Chief People Officer at Dashlane, which is a password manager that helps businesses keep all of their security simple. It also facilitates your online shopping if you're an individual that doesn't want to type in your credit card. But my reaction when I saw this data, as someone who's been in this field for 18 years now, and I'm at my third startup and did Fortune 50 in between, is that it's validating. And it's not surprising to me. I think it has power, and many people who have seen it on my LinkedIn feed have found it surprising. But to me, because I really like to be involved in communities of peers, it's not surprising, because it reflects, how we've all been feeling and what we've been experiencing.
Yeah, thanks. Cindy, let me turn that over to you next.
Thanks, Lars. I'm Cindy Gordon, and I'm currently an HR consultant and advisor. And before starting my own practice, I was a two-time head of people at 2 insurtech startups, one after the other, not at the same time. My reaction to the data, again, not surprising, but I think it shows a lot of movement. And maybe if we had looked at it 2 years ago, we wouldn't see as much variety there. So it's kind of exciting. And to Ciara's point, validating, I'm a part of the 10% bucket of leaving for time off originally. And I was a little shocked because I felt like it would have been a higher percentage, to be quite honest. But maybe it's when you poll people and where they're at now, since it's a longer time frame. But I think it is pretty staggering to see the numbers, and then the number of people who are looking to move either into other types of capacity or just to look to see what's out there. But I'm trying to take the lens of it can be an exciting time. There are a lot of opportunities out there and a lot of different ways to shape what we can do and flex our muscles.
Yeah, and we're going to get into a lot of that over the course of this discussion. But David, how about you? I'd love to get your kind of introduction and thoughts when you get a chance to see the results.
Yeah, hey everyone, I'm David. I am the CHRO at a company called Eventbrite, which is an events ticketing platform. And I've been there for almost 2 years. So I saw this data, and the thing that stood out to me was, almost 50% have left their job in the past 18 months. If you add up all those relevant buckets, I think it's like 47%. And it dawned on me that right before the pandemic, Korn Ferry released this report of average tenure by C-suite member, and they showed the CHRO average tenure. This was January 2020, so right before the pandemic, was like 3.7 years, 3.3 in tech. But so, this would suggest that the average tenure is dropping. Is more analysis needed there. But I think that feels right to me, that the average tenure for the CHROs is dropping and dropped in the pandemic because it's a difficult time. I've certainly taken jobs in the past where I get to the 3-month mark and I'm like, I'm not going to survive. How am I going to do this? So I think for many people, like even 18 months is like a lot to bite off. It feels short, but you're in some of these jobs, it's like getting to 18 months is almost a victory in some cases, depending upon the organization you're in.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if we need to start kind of recalibrating expectations on tenure, because again, in my world, I do HR executive search and other things, but I'll work with some CEOs and they'll look at profiles and wonder why somebody has consistently been somewhere under 4 years. I'm like, that's the reality of this market. That's how things are in this market now. So it's really interesting to just see how those expectations are starting to shift and change.
Hey everyone, I'm Jevan. I most recently was the Chief People and Culture Officer at Stitch Fix, an apparel retailer based on data science and human stylists. I'm in Cindy's bucket, so I finished up a couple months ago and I am catching my breath mostly. I'm trying to focus on that. And I think, everyone's shared some great reflections so far on the data. I think one of my reactions was, also, don't think of this as just the past 18 months, right? So there are folks who are about to look. There are folks who wanted to look and didn't yet. There are folks who looked, didn't find the thing. This is not sort of a moment in time. I actually think this is a bit of an inflection point for many of our peers and for a number of us, honestly. It's just how we think about what we need in the role and our lives to make this actually sustainable.
Yeah, and Jevan, I want to come back to you, and then I want to get Cindy's take on this as well, because as you both mentioned, you're part of that 10% who stepped away from a CPO role for some time off. Walk me through that thought process. Like, when did you know that was really what you needed to do? Because I imagine lots of people watching right now are maybe in that same situation, and they don't know kind of what is the manageable level of burnout or fatigue, or just, kind of being at that limit, right, where you just need a bit of a reset to come back. So if you could both share, and Jevan, I'll come to you first. What was that thought process like for you when you were kind of evaluating, should I do this? And then ultimately made the decision to pull to step out and take some time off to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I like David. I think I always plunge into a new role, very starry-eyed. This could be an 8 to 10 year job. I'm so excited about everything. And then, 3 months in, maybe it's a 4 to 5 year thing. And you got the half-life kind of keeps going. And I've worked with great teams and great companies. And so it's not necessarily about the organization. It's just, it's a really hard job. And so probably for me, I think I reflect on a couple things. And a set that are internal and a set that are external. So on the external side, I think about sort of where the company is relative to sort of where I started and what I'm trying to contribute and the impact that I'm trying to have. And you're never really done, right? So it's not that you sort of at least I've never been done, but more do I feel like I've gotten things to a place that I feel really good about, and that is sort of a good jumping off point for potentially someone else to take it forward. I think about my team, and I think when I say that, I think about the team that I lead and also the team that I'm part of as an exec team, and just sort of what are the dynamics there and how I'm feeling. And then I think I've become more aware of small signals for myself around, is this actually something that feels sustainably an environment where I'm actually going to do my best work? And so recently, one of the things, and I actually saw a few of my previous team members at Stitch Fix on here, so they can call me on it in chat if it's not incorrect. But some of the feedback that I've gotten as a leader is in your framework, Lars, around compassion, is that I have a pretty deep well of empathy, and often when I'm in an organizational situation or a leadership sort of dynamic, I'll often sort of talk with the team around, here are the different things that are going on. I don't necessarily condone, or frankly, I don't condone maybe some of the behavior, some of the things that are showing up, but let's see sort of the full set of perspectives and where people are coming from, so we know what we're working with. And one of the things that I noticed in kind of the last 6 months was the well was dry. I was sort of showing up super narrow, super reactive, and it was it's kind of like, wow, I'm getting kryptonited. And it's something that actually I've heard that is a superpower that is actually now kind of in the opposite place. And I think we all have tough moments. And when I was starting to see it emerge as a pattern, and felt like it wasn't just something I could take a vacation, go for a run and so on. It was actually something a little bit more fundamental. I sort of said, again, you sort of circle back like, well, if I'm actually not going to be the leader and the team member that this sort of organization needs from me, it's not good for any of us.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And Cindy, I'd love to get your perspective as well. Like, what was that thought process like for you?
Yeah, Jevan sounds a lot more structured and thoughtful than mine. I left my job a little over a year ago, so I've had a lot of time to reflect. And what has been interesting is, and I think arguably we could all say this, given the nature of the professions that we've chosen, but I'm a workaholic, and I'm still suffering from burnout. And I've never fully felt this way before. I think I was able to mask what I was doing and still show up for my team, for my company, and probably put myself last and my own needs. And prior to what Jevan mentioned earlier, looking at what happened prior to the 18 months and where we're at now is a series of events in my personal life that weighed down on me. And then my plan was to, as we entered 2020, to take some time off, and then we couldn't do that. And our jobs as heads of people they've always been a mile wide and a mile deep in expertise in every sub-function that we cover, but it turned into 10 miles wide and 10 miles deep in what we're managing, and we're dealing with the weight of trauma-inducing things that were happening in the world when you think about ESG, and it became too much, and I couldn't show up for my team. And similarly, I think I was getting feedback that I had a short fuse, or I raced to get to the answers quickly just to get things done. And I don't think I was really living my best life as a head of people, and I wasn't showing up for myself. And I think that was really important for me too, to realize that, okay, I can try to be everything, but everything it was like a light knock on the door, and then it turned into walls crumbling down. And that was something for me that was hard to admit and recognize. And I think I'm still struggling with that today. And it's been over a year. So, I don't even know if I have any answers on how to deal with burnout and how to, I think I'm more tuned now to understand the triggers and the signals, to be more thoughtful about whatever is next for me. I might have gone off on a tangent, but it's a bit of my own experience that still feels fairly haphazard to date.
No, I mean, I appreciate you sharing that. And again, I think with all of this, there's no, everybody's gonna be experiencing this on their own level and on their own terms, and everybody's gonna have their own kind of marker in terms of when they know it's time to take a step back or to do something different. And David and Ciara, I want to get your perspective on this next question. Obviously you're both in operator roles now, global organizations, been through a lot in the pandemic, as we all have. Like, how do you think about self-care? How do you think about kind of identifying maybe some of the warning signs of the pressures and the stress where you need to do something, whatever that might be, to allow yourself to reset a little bit? And Ciara, I'll go to you first on that one.
Well, I think like Cindy said, I'm not sure that I have this all figured out, but certainly it's been something that I've struggled with, that has been a challenge. And I think that I have a lot of respect for the people who actually have stepped aside after experiencing burnout, because I'm someone who definitely got really deep into it at my last job and did not step aside. And probably, to be completely honest, like fear of walking away from it, or fear of not doing anything and just having unstructured time with all of my resentments and feelings, is probably what held me back. And I happened to find Dashlane where I was already a customer, and the culture was very different from my last company, and I went there. But I experienced, like, how do you try to heal burnout while you're still working in the same job, right? While a lot of things, like when a manager does the same frustrating thing that you were already very frustrated about and you overreact to it, etc. But I think that after 4 years at Dashlane now, I feel like I have worked through a lot of it, and I'm really thankful to my current CEO and the past two, because I've had 3 bosses in the past 18 months, which was not relaxing, but we did it. And I think if they were not reasonable, respectful, understanding, I don't think that I would have been able to get through it. And for me, it's not only did you take time for yourself, did you have a reasonable workload, but it's as much about what I've read in burnout about the resentments that build up. Because going on a vacation doesn't solve it for me or for a lot of other people from what I've read. It's just like there are a lot of things that didn't go away that felt good. And how do you actually get enough of that resolved where you're not constantly reminded of it, where you're not showing up, as Jevan and Cindy said, where you're in the meeting and you're being reactive and you know that that's not how you should be.
Yeah. And David, I'm curious to get your perspective on that as well. How do you think about kind of preserving your reserves and yourself as you're carrying just all the different pressures and stresses of the role today?
Yeah, I think these are all really well said statements, and so I want to plus one to what I'm hearing, nodding my head. And there's another aspect, which is just your mental health. I've certainly been in jobs before where I would just like wake up in the middle of the night, and I'm like, I've got so much on my mind that some random topic will wake me up in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I will not sleep the rest of the night, or I'll have a hard time getting back to sleep. Those are things that are sort of like, hey, this is kind of a mental health thing now. Like, am I getting help? Am I taking care of myself? Am I using modern health for myself, or spring health, or whatever the benefit is? Am I doing this? Oftentimes HR teams, they don't take care of themselves. They focus on taking care of others, and they don't take care of themselves. And similarly, probably CHROs find themselves in that mode of not taking care of themselves. And then another way I think about burnout is just, there's kind of things like that I know I don't care about, but we need to get done and execute on them. And there are the things that I care about. It actually gives me energy in my job. And suddenly I don't care about those things anymore. That's like, whoa, big warning sign, because something is eating away at you. The things that give you energy, that kind of like refill your cup, and kind of alluding to what Jevan was alluding to. Those are the things that kind of keep you coming back each day. And if suddenly you don't care about those things, then it's like, something's broken. Maybe I do need to step away. Maybe I need to find a way to get the help, the support. Maybe it's a key hire I need some resources, because I'm being drained of all these other things that is like preventing me from caring about the things I usually care about.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And it's so interesting. I think when you look at the things, particularly over the last 18 months, and this was, the scope and expectations of HR and people ops was broadening before the pandemic. So let's, kind of own that. But it's jumped, magnitudes since the pandemic. And I have to credit for this one, Patreon's Chief People Officer, Tiffany Stevens, and we were doing an event, and she used the term Chief Pandemic Officer, for CPO. And to me, it's so reflective of what I refer to now. It's like the Department of Plus One. It's like all of these new things that have come up have just been kind of pushed over to HR. So, pandemic, HR is going to figure this out and drive this. Shifting to remote and hybrid and distributed, HR has got this. How to build culture in a distributed organization when you used to be co-located, HR's got this. Social justice and consciousness and the conversations we're having now about equity in the workplace, HR's got this. It feels like all of these new things that are coming up. And in some ways, again, it goes back to that duality point. It's exciting because, again, our role is elevated, it's central, we're involved in executing on all of these things. But on the other side, we're not always given the resources or the budgets that we need to do that effectively. It's just like, well, just add this to your plate. And that's what starts to feel overwhelming. And so, I'd love to get really all of your perspectives. And Jevan, I'll start with you. when you were in your operating role and all these new things were kind of being added to your plate, and I imagine most of the viewers and listeners who are watching us are probably in a similar position. How can you embrace the broadening of scope, but also make sure that you're advocating for yourself and your team for the resources you need to be able to execute that effectively?
Yes, I have that answer right off the shelf here. I think everything that we've sort of been talking about in this thread is so spot on. And I think the additional challenge is, I suspect everyone who's joining the call today took the role in a company that they're really excited about that was doing hard things already. So it's not even just these very, very hard things got stacked on top. If the job was already hard, right? The team was already overwhelmed. And so I think for me, as we were kind of going through the last 18 months, in many ways, it was sort of a conversation with my leaders and then also with other executives, in particular with my CEO, to sort of say the Maslow's hierarchy that we had is completely off now, right? Like we got to start over. Like what is actually at the bottom of the pyramid? What do we have to go after? Like we got to restack everything and we got to rethink these tiers. And then I need you to help me be very explicit around where the trade-off's going to be. Right? Because everyone wants all the things. Everyone wants all the things tomorrow, not yesterday. And there's a piece around capacity. In some cases, there's a piece around, do we even have the right expertise around the table? So, I think, there have been all kinds of new roles that have been cropping up, I think, in relation to sort of these new challenges and these new programs that we need to sort of build, advisory and experts and so on. And so it's almost, in many ways, I think it really was a reset of sort of saying, like, what is the people strategy? What are the organizational priorities? Because it's not just actually swapping in three big things and kind of mixing and matching. I think it's really, in many ways, a pretty massive reset. But the hard thing, of course, is that not everyone sees it that way. And so how can you hopefully have the trust with your CEO to have that really honest conversation, and then of course in the end of the day to have them actually advocate for your team, because that's the only way to really get the boundaries that you need.
Jevan, that was an amazing answer, so I'm not going to force anybody to add on to that. Ciara, David, did either of you have anything you'd want to add on anything that Jevan said as a foundation?
I guess the only thing that comes to mind for me is that's one of the great challenges of our role. And I think it's something that the CEOs that we work with probably understand well, right? Especially in a scaling business, there's so much that you could do that you believe will make a positive impact, but at some level, you can't stay up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week and do it, or you're not going to do anything well. So I feel like in a way, that's what we've always been practicing in scaling businesses. And when all of the pandemic stuff was suddenly thrown on top of it and it was new and there were no previous best practices to look to, that took trying to, practice that for ourselves to just a whole other level. But what I've seen is you have to be in a good enough place yourself with what David was saying with your mental health to be able to really work on, okay, where do I draw the line and how do I prioritize and what do we actually need to do versus we don't necessarily need to do that and we should rest instead. And it's just something that's really hard. There's
a really interesting exchange going on in the chat here. And to kind of sum it up, there's this notion of should the chief people officer that sometimes step aside for some random people or culture topic that's being debated. But would that then signal that you're not up to the task of this random thing? And I look at it a little bit differently, which is that sometimes in an exec team meeting, there's a discussion where we quickly go to, we need a training for XYZ, and everyone looks at David. And there's a conflation of, is this an HR thing or is this a leadership thing we're talking about? And so what are you really getting at? Something that we need to train our leaders on suddenly, that you're going to assign me homework in Q4 to do. What are we getting at? Something is missing that you want to have happen. And then how can you do that? How can you take ownership of that? So there's a subtle sort of shifting of the conversation to, you're a competent leader. You have the ability to change the culture of your team, change the competence of your team, the leadership, the talent, the people. What would you propose doing on that? and sort of putting it back there so you're not abdicating responsibility, you're engaging in a conversation, but like, what are we getting at here? What do you want to try and accomplish? What specifically are you saying? Because I think a lot of these things is just a conflation of like, this is an HR homework assignment suddenly versus, no, this is a leadership discussion we're having.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you raised that, because I think that does kind of, go back to this idea of department of plus one, or there's certain, I think in a lot of ways that the field of HR can be, the function of HR, I should say, can be misunderstood by the executive team. It's like the default is like, oh, this thing involves people, HR does it, or HR should own it and they should run it. And that's not always the case. And so I want to kind of shift the conversation a bit more now towards things that we want CEOs and boards and executive teams to know about kind of building and leading a people function now. And I'll have some specific questions here to get into for all of you, but I think, just to open up with maybe a statement, David, I'll come right back to you on this one. And this isn't, by the way, I should qualify, none of this, especially for David and Ciara, these are not statements to your own CEOs. These are just broadly speaking, as HR leaders, these are the things that CEOs generally should know. So what is one thing that CEOs should know about the people function that's often misunderstood from your perspectives? And David, I'll start with you.
Well, I think that the conflation of the HR and leadership thing I was talking about there is one. But I think the idea of who owns the outcomes of people, whether we're talking about regretted attrition and engagement, and like hitting our hiring goals, who owns those? And if I have a bunch of red check marks on my dashboard there for those things, how did that happen? And should we say, oh, we got to reorg the HR function because you're not hitting your goals? Well, hold on, time out a second. Who's accountable for building teams? It's kind of like, if I'm the CFO, I'm going to show you the financial metrics, but if they're really poor, is that my job? That we weren't able to sell this quarter, or we didn't have products that sold. So I think that's misunderstood, the idea of the metrics, like HR owns them. And if there's something wrong there, then I have the wrong people in the HR job.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Ciara, I'd love to get your perspective next.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what David said, and I would add one of the things that probably doesn't happen often enough, both from CEOs and from us as incumbents in the role leading the function, is talking early on like, what would we define success as for the people team? Because sometimes it turns into a popularity contest. Sometimes it turns into somebody had an opinion that something should be more important, but your team thought that something else should be prioritized above it. So what's the way to do that is respectful of the CEO's time and scope? Because it's hard for us to keep track of everything we do and think about. So we can't expect that a CEO is going to have full appreciation and full understanding for everything the team is doing, because their scope is even broader, right? And they need to think about other things. But what's the time efficient way to agree on that and make sure there's enough alignment that when we're all in those challenging situations and things are moving really quickly, that, there's not the whole, no, this shouldn't be my job. Yes, it should be kind of dynamic that happens much more often than you would think with really smart, really metric driven, really high business acumen individuals, but still happens.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I think that that comment on alignment certainly applies between the CPO and the CEO. I'd probably even loop in the other executives in on that, because I think, you all have one of those weird jobs where like everybody has an opinion of what you should do. All of your executive peers feel like they know how HR should be run and the outcomes you should be producing. And so if there isn't that kind of full alignment across the C-suite, you may end up being in a position where like you're hitting the ball out of the park for what you and the CEO have agreed upon, but maybe the CFO has a different set of expectations, or the CMO has a different set of expectations, and that wasn't discussed, especially kind of in the onboarding stage when you come into an organization. So we'll talk about onboarding more in a minute, but I think that piece is really important to make sure that alignment, kind of goes across the entire XCOM kind of peer set, so that everybody's aligned on kind of what you're doing and what you're not doing. Cindy, how about you? Thoughts on that? What should CEOs know about HR teams and people teams that they don't?
I think our role is unique, and I don't know if this probably spans for the existence of having CHR or CPO and their role, but our roles can be confusing to executives and to employees alike. We need to be able to switch hats or wear multiple hats at the same time. We might be the confidant or coach to the CEO, but we also report into the CEO, and we're held accountable for business outcomes. And we are a strategic business function on top of trying to help workplaces navigate humans and humans navigate workplaces. And there's a whole behavioral element to what we do, and expecting something to shift overnight, or expecting a change to be easily comprehended and implemented when it might take a lot of change management and task relevant maturity to understand. That is something that I feel oftentimes goes amiss. And I'm just seeing more of what's happening now, where we have an equal playing field as executives and running our functions. And it doesn't remove the layers of complexity in trying to manage the human aspect, which is why everything gets swept our way the moment it has to do with something tricky or sticky or complex. Okay, the people team can handle that. And it does take a collective effort and equal ownership. So I'm like piling on to what Ciara and David have already said, but we have complex roles, and it takes time and it takes resources, and that's what we need in order to get everything done. Now that the breadth of what we do has expanded, and the nature of the industry and the talent pool has shifted to be more of a like candidates world right now. We need to understand that and shift our strategy to fit that model. And that's unique.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Jevan, bring us home. What should CEOs know about the people function that they often don't?
Yeah, I all the points that have been made really deeply resonate for me, and I think they connect to me I don't think enough CEOs really understand actually what an amazing partnership with a chief people officer really looks like. And Beth's point around it's not sort of cheerleading you and saying yes and just executing on the thing. It's actually pushing back hard sometimes and really challenging you, particularly in typically things that you have a blind spot on that you're really uncomfortable about, right? Because that's the nature of actually doing the right work. And also I would say, I've had conversations with CEOs where it's kind of one of those softball questions, but not a softball question, right? So if someone comes in and does an amazing job at this, at this role in a year, what's changed? And sometimes people will literally kind of rattle off the bullets of the job description. Well, exec comp is messy, so they'll fix exec comp, and the HR tech stack needs to be a lot better, and so on. And A, my immediate reaction is, wow, this sounds like the most boring job ever. And B, it's just sort of like, wow, what a shame. What a shame. Your people function is not ever going to unleash the value that it possibly could, because that's how you think about it. Like just tick off some boxes, right? And so for them to really understand, well, to Cindy's point, if the people function is to be a strategic business function, then it means you and your chief people officer have to be joined at the hip, and you actually have a responsibility to do a couple things. The first is the nature of our jobs means we don't necessarily, if you're not deliberate, have as much interaction or exposure to all of the business decisions that are being made, right? And so it's what I found in my experience, the best CEOs are really, really deliberate about making sure their chief people officers are in those conversations, or that they're sharing it very, very proactively. Hey, you need to know this is going on over here. That's the context for this, right? And so that we can actually integrate that into our work and also share it with our teams. The second thing I would say is, as a little bit of a callback to David's point, you want to be a best place to work. You want an amazing culture that everyone talks about, and I'm just supposed to deliver that in 18 months. How about you are a co-pilot in creating that? You're the CEO of this company. People are going to talk a lot more about you on Glassdoor, right? This is your company. You have a responsibility to be a partner in that. And, I look to you to actually have a really great point of view and a vision and perspective that, frankly, I'm going to push back on and have ideas and so on, right? But if you're just looking to me to fill the void, no matter how great I sort of show up, we've actually already lost the game. because that is fundamentally part of the CEO's responsibility.
That's such a great point. And I think, when you look at how leaders like that may think about being able to just kind of push off things like, HR owns culture or HR owns diversity, equity, inclusion. No, we don't. And if that's your view as a CEO, I'm sorry, those are never going to be, optimal functions within the business unless you're personally involved, invested in setting that tone for the entire leadership team. Let's help CEOs hire a bit more effectively. I think, as we know, we saw the numbers at the beginning of the session, lots of turnover in the field, almost half of the field, based on 280 responses, half of the heads of people have left a role since January of last year. So lots of companies are hiring right now. I don't need to tell you all this. You're getting the emails and the in-mails and the calls. What do you want to know? I'm curious, most job descriptions are terrible. That applies to all jobs, but certainly even executive roles. When you think about evaluating opportunities, how can CEOs, and I know they're not the ones writing the job descriptions, but when they're hiring a CPO on their team, how can they write a job description that will be compelling and meaningful for you? What information do you want to see up front that you're often not seeing up front that will help you better evaluate how you align or don't with that role? And David, I want to come to you first on that. Again, with a disclaimer, this doesn't mean that anybody is looking for jobs. I'm just looking for perspectives and ideas on what would make a compelling job description for CPOs today.
I think, what does the CEO envision for success for this role, right? So I'm hiring this role. I got board feedback. There's a reason why I'm hiring for this. If the person is wildly successful in X years, what does that look like to the CEO? 5 to 7 sentences. And what's on that CEO's mind could be something that's really out there, or it could be just really table stakes. It's kind of it gives you a little bit better, insight in terms versus the responsibilities and all that sort of stuff. So a vision of success for the person.
Yeah. Cindy, how about you?
I'm +1 to what David said. I'm going to look at how it's valued at the organization, and a few factors that might feed into that is why are you looking to fill this role now? Give me some context. It will look very different if it's a backfill role, if it's a late stage company that's looking to fill their first time head of people role, or if it's an early stage. So have some context there. And I'm looking for transparency and a level of honesty that might say, hey, we didn't get it right, and now we're looking. I'd rather hear that than some pitch on why it didn't work out that has zero level of introspection and what it could look like ahead. So I think that's one thing. I like to talk to the CEO if there is somebody else that is being tasked to fill the role. That already signals to me the level of importance that it might have, and the level of touch point and exposure that I'll have to the CEO. If it's an exec search firm, then that's my advice to exec search firm if you're on this call. And then another piece is compensation. And I am not driven by money, but the work that we do is really important, and we're seeing that in the market now. And I'm relieved to see that we're starting to see things equalize a bit relative to other executives in the space. And I'll be looking at that too as a signal on the level of importance in the role to the organization, and the ability to trust me and the experience and skills that I bring to the table through, I don't know, conversations about what they're looking for in the role. That's to tack on to what David said earlier. But those are things I'd be looking for in order to engage. And I'll also look at the bench of talent on the exec team. So I'll want to know more about the decisions that are made there, and then governing structure and decision making.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad. I appreciate the response. I'm glad you mentioned comp, but we're going to come back to that after this question because I do want to get into some more specifics around that. But Ciara, how about you? What do CEOs and organizations need to be including in the job descriptions when hiring CPOs today?
Yeah, so I think there was a lot that was already said, and like what I would add to that, because I completely agree with what David and Cindy said, is make it your own. So I would also say that to any search professionals who are helping, like, of course, a CEO is busy and they're going to ask you for what does a job description usually look like. But I think for a lot of us, whether we're advising our friends or we look at it ourselves, we're trying to identify which part did the CEO edit and how can we read into their personality. But a lot of it is just like really boilerplate that we don't need because we hire people for people functions. So I would say like be more authentic. And even if you're hiring a first time leader of the people function and you don't know completely what all those things are, it's okay to show that, right? I think that's better than you meet and speak with someone who has very detailed bullet points that came through, a search professional saying this is what other companies have used, and that person doesn't like even feel connected or know what some of those processes really are. So yeah, being more authentic.
And Jevan, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of going through all the things that I want to ask that really people wouldn't put in a JD, even if you try to force them to. But I think one of the things I look for really early on is a sense of sort of what the genre of sort of work is. And I think it's typically a build. There's nothing really there. Build it all. There is something there. It's in pretty bad shape. It's basically a rebuild. Or there's actually a lot there that's pretty decent, but this is, kind of like a next chapter up-leveling, transformative kind of thing, right? And like none of those are, have sort of relative worth. They're just really different, and they're really different in terms of the energy they ask from you and sort of how you need to show up. And frankly, I think that the strengths of the right leader that would match to them. And it's often like I have to like dig, and like 3 conversations in, I'm like, I think this is really what it is. Which honestly, I think honestly, sometimes people like they're kind of like hiding the ball a little bit because they're worried that you'll react and so on. It's like anyone good is going to figure out what this is, right? You should just tell us up front so we know, and then you'll get the right person who's excited to do it. The other thing, Ciara's point really resonated me for me is like, how do you sort of move through the opaqueness of clearly edited stuff from other people? And it's just kind of interesting because I think now that the demand for this function and leaders in this function has risen so dramatically, I would love to see CEOs raise their game and how they think about attraction, right? So if you just sort of take a page from everything we've been doing in technical recruiting for the last, sort of decade, do a 30-second Loom video. Just like pitch me, tell me who you are, tell me what pitch me on the company, tell me about what you're excited about and so on, right? And that, I think, that's what we're all doing in the first 5 minutes with the CEO. It's just sort of imprinting on who are they, what's the vibe, what's the chemistry, what do they care about? And then I think, that you'll get faster to the match that you actually want.
One additional thing.
Yeah, Cindy, go ahead.
One additional thing to add on when it comes to a job spec, I rarely, maybe this is bad, read, it's kind of like a resume. I rarely read through it with a fine-tooth comb, but I notice the bad ones that like you want to avoid. And so I don't think you need to spend a shit ton of time writing this beautifully like scripted job spec but you need enough to make the hook, and that's where authenticity comes into play. The bad ones are like flashing lights where you're not even going to engage.
Yeah, and look, let's be real. The bar is very low on job descriptions. You don't have to be that creative or innovative. Like to Jevan's point, a 30-second Loom video takes you 30 seconds, maybe a few extra minutes to think about what you want to say, but it's not a heavy lift, and it makes a big difference for people to both self-select in or out. So definitely don't sleep on the job description. I think you want to make sure you're investing time in there. Speaking of time, we're winding down. I do want to kind of jump on comp really quickly, because I want to get each of your perspectives on just how CEOs should be thinking about CPO comp. And I'll take this wherever you want. If you want to take it to a range, great. If you want to take a philosophical approach, great. For me, I think what I generally advise CEOs is you really have to be thinking about, if you're bringing in a CHRO, a CPO, somebody at that C-suite level, and you're not paying them on par with their C-suite counterparts, you're not pricing this job correctly, because that's the big question. It's not necessarily even that it's a set X dollar amount, but if obviously all of you are going to have access to all the data, and if you go into a new role and you found that all your executive peers are making a chunk of money above you, that is not a great onboarding situation. So I want to just open this up freeform. Anybody who has thoughts on how to frame how CEOs should be thinking about executive compensation for CPOs specifically?
Pay them the most.
I don't think you're going to find any objections on this this gathering to that comment. So, other thoughts? How we should be thinking about, or how CEOs should be thinking about executive comp?
I think the CHRO and CFO are like maybe one of 2 or 3 of the executive team members who get to see all the comp. So, CHRO sits alongside the other G&A executives. And so to have any big disparity there is kind of eyebrow raising. Like, I would not really have a great disparity there, absent any significant experience difference. So I'd be thinking about that cohort first, of how am I paying the CHRO alongside the CFO, general counsel, the G&A executives.
Anybody else have anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I would say that in most of scaling companies now, especially if you're not doing it yet, when you bring on a chief people officer, you'll be looking at pay equity or fairness, right, across the board, and looking at that by different protected characteristics. And if you look at your executive team and you look at the predominance of women as well in the top HR role, and then you look at the makeup of the prominence of people in most of the other roles. So I think that's something that also needs to be thought of. And like, certainly I'm pragmatic, and I would not, demand I need to be paid the same exact thing as the men that I work with in different functions. But we do see that the market data is catching up, right? And every year when we see the executive pay studies, we see that it's getting closer and closer in this function. And then with so many roles being open, as you showed in the graph in the first place, that's only driving the salary growth up more. So I think that sometimes CEOs talk to a lot of people and say, okay, when you hired your first head of people, what did it cost? And somebody says, well, I hired someone who was a recruiting director, and somebody else says, I hired someone who did this 3 times. Like, that's a very different market rates. So there's a lot of variation out there, but as usual, like, listen to your candidates' expectations and then calibrate that against how you're already paying others in the organization, and make sure that it's fair and it's equitable.
That's such a great point. And I just want to express gratitude to all of you for sharing your own experience, stories, being vulnerable and real around your own experiences in this. I do want to end on a high note. As I mentioned early on, the duality of this moment, yes, it's been challenged. Yes, burnout is rampant, but yes, we have this amazing opportunity ahead of us to really transform the field itself. And so, rapid fire, I want to hit each of you with this. In one sentence, what gives you hope and optimism about the future of the field? And Jevan, I'm going to kick off with you.
I think we as a function and as leaders have more, sort of permission to say exactly what we want and to say no. And to just be super direct and unapologetic about it, because this is what we need to succeed and to do good work. And I think people are going to have to just deal with it.
Ciara, how about you?
I think it's really the people who are in this function, right? And especially after the past 18 months and everything that we've been through, you see, like, even if some people need to take a break or switch to something else, like, we are people who are undeterred for fighting for a better workplace experience for everybody who's there, a better future of work, to redefine work, as you said, Lars, and as you've been doing so much work on. And so if none of this can stop us, then that gives me a lot of hope for what we can handle. And it's nice to see that everything that we do handle is starting to be a bit more recognized and appreciated.
And how about you, Cindy?
I think what the other said is spot on. We have a platform now in support to do what we want to do in our roles, and it's the time to ask for what we need and be unapologetic about it. And I'm excited to see some creativity and what offshoots might happen from this new world of looking at our function and our roles as being industry leaders.
And David, take us home.
Yeah, plus one to all that. And just, last thing to add is I'm just coincidentally seeing a lot of posts from CEOs and VC people saying, hey, from experience, my biggest recommendation is hire a great head of people early on. So it seems like there's something changing there, because I didn't see those types of posts, 5 years ago. So that gives me hope.
Cool. Well, all of you, thanks so much for coming on, sharing your wisdom. All of you spending some time with us live and lighting up that chat room. Thanks so much for sharing your own experiences and wisdom. And that's a wrap for today. So take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lars.
Thanks, Lars.